This SHIUR is sponsored for the academic year by Dr. and Mrs. Menachem Marcus in memory of their beloved aunts Irma Haas and Hilda Meyer. Thank you so much for your sponsorship. Okay, so we are now a week before Tisha B'Av, and what I wanted to do today was to do, again, something connected to Tisha B'Av. I know that normally we do Parshat HaShavua. The truth was, I didn't even know. I knew that there was no class next week, but I didn't know that the classes after that were canceled. So I thought we would be picking up with Parshat HaShavua in a couple of weeks. But I just heard that we are now, after this week, we're on a break for a few weeks. By the time you pick up again, my father will be back, Be'ezrat Hashem, and able to pick up his class. So I will miss you as well. So this is our last opportunity to learn together. But at least for now. But I wanted to do something on Tisha B'Av, and specifically because I feel that in general, Tisha B'Av is a day that I believe many of us, myself included, have trouble connecting to. It's never fun to be sad. No one likes to be sad in general. And as we know, the events connected to Tisha B'Av, specifically the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, is something that was so long ago, a bit more foreign. I do believe that this year we might be able to connect to things because of contemporary events that are happening. It might become more real to us in terms of certain aspects of destruction and death that we've unfortunately, as a people, have been experiencing. I saw around time of Shivasar B'Tammuz, I saw there was a meme going around that no one needs to be told about the danger of a broken fence or of breaching of walls. Whereas normally Shivasar B'Tammuz is the day we commemorate the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem, and something that we don't necessarily fully understand. But this year, after seeing the results of the breaching of the walls of the wall connecting Gaza to the Gaza envelope and the destruction that ensued, that we all can definitely better relate to the idea of the danger of a wall or a fence being breached and being broken down. But nevertheless, I think that, as I said, in general, connecting to Tisha B'Av, connecting to the events of the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, is something that I think is hard for us to relate to, and as a result, many of us kind of spend Tisha B'Av just trying to kind of get the day by. We watch certain movies about destruction. Maybe we'll read a little bit. We'll sit, and if we can, if we're feeling up to it, maybe we'll go to some Kinot and read the Kinot and try to connect in any way, shape, or form. But I think, as with anything else, Tisha B'Av requires preparation. Just like whenever we want to have meaning in a Chag, on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or Sukkot or Pesach, the more that we prepare for that Chag, the more meaningful it is. The more that we create a mindset preparing for that Chag, the more meaningful it's going to be. The same thing is really true with Tisha B'Av. This is something that we've spoken about a little bit. How Rav Soloveitchik famously talks about the need to build up to the morning on Tisha B'Av, and how the Avelut Yishana, which is the Avelut, the mourning that we do for the Beit HaMikdash, is fundamentally different from the Avelah Chadasha, which is the Avelut that we normally have for the loss of a loved one. And for the loss of a loved one, usually we have the most intense time is the moment of destruction, is the moment when the death happens. That's how Avelut Chadasha usually begins. It begins with the most intense, and then over time the intensity lessens. When it comes to the 3 weeks and the 9 days and Tisha B'Av, we go in the opposite direction. We begin with the 3 weeks, which is a lesser form of mourning. The 9 days, things intensify. During what's called Shavua Shechalbo, the week of Tisha B'Av, which is going to be starting this coming Sunday, we intensify even more. And then, of course, the day of Tisha B'Av itself is the most intense day of the mourning. Why is it fundamentally different? Why is it the exact opposite? So Rav Soloveitchik famously talked about how the mourning for the Beit HaMikdash, as opposed to the mourning of Avelut Chadasha, which is felt intensely at the very beginning, the Avelut Yishana, the Avelut for the Beit HaMikdash, needs to be taught. It needs to be developed. It's not natural for us to necessarily experience and feel the loss of the Beit HaMikdash, because it happened so many thousands of years ago, and therefore it needs to be taught. If you look at source number 1, Soloveitchik, really, I brought a number of times his words, because his words are really, really, really very, very beautiful. Source number one: with Avelut Yishana, there is no spontaneous reaction. The reality of the lack of a Beit HaMikdash all these years has become normal for us. There is always an equation between reality and normality. Whatever is real is normal, and whatever is normal is real. People do not look upon reality as abnormal, and so the Avelut is much harder. There is more than a risk. There is a natural reality that over time, people will forget. It's natural for us to just not feel connected to this reality, especially when we're here in Eretz Yisrael walking around, and despite the dangers and despite all the destruction, you walk around in Eretz Yisrael that's being developed and continues to grow and continues to, in many different ways, flourish. So it's hard for us to really then mourn something that, when we look around, doesn't seem to be so bad. Obviously, not current events notwithstanding. Thus, the mourning of Tisha B'Av has to be taught. One must understand it thoroughly and be sensitive to it. We must learn how to mourn, to wail and weep for the Churban Beit HaMikdash. And therefore it has to be taught. And that is how Rav Soloveitchik explains why we work in the exact opposite direction when it comes to Avelut Yishana. We start with the 3 weeks. We begin to prepare. 9 days, we prepare even more. And then eventually we try to get to Tisha B'Av, which was meant to be really a day of crying, a day of Bechi. And Rav Soloveitchik uses this idea to also explain two interesting other phenomenon and different differences between Avelut Yishana and Avelut Chadasha. One difference is the commandment to cry. It says there is no, in the laws of Avelut Chadasha, in the laws of regular Avelut, if a person is in Shiva for their loved one, there is no halacha that a person is supposed to cry. Why not? You don't need halacha. It's natural. It's normal. It's the visceral reaction to loss. And therefore, there's no command, there's no halacha that a person should try to bring themselves to tears. It's totally natural. As opposed to the laws of Avelut Yishana, the laws of mourning for the Beit HaMikdash, there actually is a concept of trying to tap into this a part of ourselves that brings about the crying for the Beit HaMikdash. Why does it need to be commanded? Because it's not normal. It's not natural. It's something that needs to be developed, something that needs to be taught. That's one difference. Another difference he points out is the law is a specifically a shita of Rav Soloveitchik regarding the halachot of what you're allowed to learn on Tisha B'Av. Okay, we know that when it comes to Avelut Chadasha, when a person is in the Shiva for a loved one, so a person, he's not allowed to learn. You're not supposed to learn Torah. Torah is misameach, misamchem yishrei lev. Yishar misamchem lev. Excuse me. Pekudei Hashem yishar misamchem lev. And therefore, because Torah is meant to bring a certain happiness, therefore there is a halacha that a person shouldn't learn Torah during their personal avilut. What about on Tisha B'Av? So as we all know, on Tisha B'Av as well, there is a limitation to what a person should learn. Although there is an expanded heter to what you can. We're supposed to learn things that are connected to sadness, things that are connected to the story of Eov, the stories in Navi about the destruction, the Gemaras that are connected to the destruction. Rav Soloveitchik as well was famous for expanding this heter to many other things as well. Soloveitchik was very, very makil, lenient when it came to how much Torah he would allow a person to learn on Tisha B'Av. And it came from this fundamental assertion that if we want to understand Tisha B'Av, we want to connect to Tisha B'Av, we need to learn about it. And therefore, he was making to let people learn other things which certain Rabbanim would have been like, that's something you shouldn't learn on Tisha B'Av. He was famous for allowing or being very expansive in what he allowed people to learn on Tisha B'Av, if it was help that person to understand and relate to the day that they're experiencing the day of Tisha B'Av. If you look at source number 2, the Soloveitchik explains why this is. Why was he so lenient? Furthermore, I believe that what is indicated here is that while the study of Torah is prohibited on Tisha B'Av, the study of events that happened in Tisha B'Av is not only permitted, but it is in and of itself a fulfillment of the Avilut. Learning on Tisha B'Av about what happened is not just, I'm allowed to do it, it's what you should be doing, says Rav Soloveitchik on Tisha B'Av. Understanding what Tisha B'Av means, a retrospective re-experiencing and reliving of the events it commemorates, appreciating its meaning in Jewish history, and particularly the consequences and results of the catastrophe that struck us so many years ago that it commemorates, is identical to Kiyum Avilut. Kiyum Avilut means that is the fulfillment, that is the way that you fulfill the Avilut of Tisha B'Av. On Tisha B'Av, Avilut means to understand what happened that understanding or intellectual analysis is to be achieved, as we will see, in the light of both Torah shebichtav and Torah shebal peh, the written law and the oral law. Without the knowledge and understanding that comes from such study, our avelut would be lacking. Avelut yishana, the mourning resulting from the Churban Beit HaMikdash, is different from avelut chadasha, the private mourning that follows the death of a relative. In the case of the latter, one does not have to understand in order to mourn, to weep, or to feel the loss. But in the case of Avelut Yishana, one must understand it thoroughly in order to experience it. That is why we must be permitted to study the events of Tisha B'Av on that day, even though there's a general prohibition of Torah study. And so therefore, even though generally when it comes to Avelut, we say no learning Torah makes you happy, here, if that Avelut is going to help you in your understanding of what's going on, in your processing, in the creation, in the building of what we're trying to create on Tisha B'Av, that Rav Soloveitchik said was not only allowed, but was actually, as he called it, kiyum avelut. It was an actual fulfillment of the avelut process of the mourning itself. And therefore, as we are now approaching Tisha B'Av, or a week before Tisha B'Av, I think that one of the best ways that we can prepare for Tisha B'Av is to learn a little bit about some of the texts of Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is not just a day that has no text. It has two main texts. It has the Megillat Eicha, and you have the Kinot. And while for many of us, I know for myself personally, these were texts that I don't really look into. I would read through it as we were reading it on Tisha B'Av. Not reading Eicha, I would skim through it, and it's obviously has a lot of tremendous pain and a tremendous sorrow. And the Kinot as well. I would sit there but I think that in order to be able to properly process, in order to be able to properly understand and to connect to what we're trying to connect to on Tisha B'Av, what we really need to do is to spend time before Tisha B'Av, thinking about understanding and processing some of the themes of Tisha B'Av. So what I wanted to do today was to really just discuss a number of major themes that are found both in Megillat Eicha and also in the Kinot as well. And through that, hopefully, we'll be able to connect more, and it'll be a proper preparation for Tisha B'Av itself. One other just short point, which you may have already noticed the theme, but much of what we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to be quoting from Rav Soloveitchik. And the main reason is that for at least myself, and for I know many people, the Kinot and Eicha were a closed book. They're very hard to understand. Some parts of it are easy to understand. We have the Art Scroll Kinot, which made tremendous headways in helping to translate and helping us to understand better the Kinot. But Rav Soloveitchik used to every single year, for many years, he'd have a day in Boston where he would basically sit all day and go through the Kinot throughout the entire day. And a number of recordings of that was made, and a book came out a number of years ago. I think it was edited by Rabbi Jacob J. Schachter. And in it really, again, opens up both Eicha and the Kinos in a very, very unique way, and in a way that for many of us, we would have trouble connecting to the Kinos and to Eicha without it, and therefore I use that very much as a base for much of what we're going to be talking about today. So it all starts with Eicha. Before we get to the Kinos, we have to understand Eicha. So Rav Soloveitchik used to suggest and explain that Eicha and the Kinos are not just simply two texts that we recite, and they happen to be one after the other, but they're fundamentally intertwined. Eicha is actually called in Chazal Megillat Kinot. Eicha itself is, on some level, the first Kina. The way that Rav Soloveitchik used to phrase it was that Eicha is the Torah shebichtav, and Kinot are the Torah shebal peh. That much of the Kinot, that Eicha is really the first Kina, but it's not just the first Kina, it's the most authentic Kina. Because this was a Kina that was written by Yirmiyahu HaNavi. This was Yirmiyahu HaNavi's response to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash is written in Megillas Eicha. And therefore, if we want to understand, or we want to connect to the most authentic reaction to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, what we have in front of us is Megillas Eicha. And Megillas Eicha, and then what the Kinos really are, suggests Rav Soloveitchik, is really just a commentary on Eicha. Eicha sets the tone. Eicha is what is the main, most authentic response. And then the Kinot that were written generations later are really on some level just building off of the framework that was set by Megillas Eicha. And so the first thing that jumps out, and this is what I wanted to just spend a little bit of time discussing, is to try to understand the first word of Megillas Eicha. The first word of Megillas Eicha is Eicha. Now, what does Eicha mean? How? Okay, good. So then we're going to see that there are actually two main explanations, two suggestions, two main explanations for what Eicha, for Eicha itself. The first one, the simplest one, is the one that many of you just said. Eicha means how. Now, how do I know that Eicha means how? Well, the best way to understand is to see where else do we see the word Eicha in context. So look at source number 3, Eicha Rabbah. Eicha Rabbah, this is the Medrash in Megillas Eicha, quotes a couple of other times where the word Eicha is used, and in that context, we can understand what Eicha means here. Eicha yashva badad, source number 3. Shlosha niviim nava'u bilashon Eicha. There were 3 niviim that prophesied using the word Eicha. The Elohim, and this is who they are. Moshe, Yeshaya, Yirmiyah. Where did Moshe? Moshe Amar, it's in this week's Parsha, Eicha asa livadi, which basically means he's complaining to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how can I personally hold the nation? So there again, how? How can I personally hold the nation? Yeshaya Amar, Yeshaya, in Sefer Yeshaya Amar, Eicha Haita Lizona Kiryat Ne'emana. How could it be that someone who was a fundamental part of our Kiryat Ne'emana, she was a staple of truth or a staple of stability, became a zonah, became a prostitute? Again, Eicha there means as well, how is this possible? How could it happen? And then we have Yirmiyah Amar, Eicha Yashva Badad. Eicha means, how could this city, how could this city, Yashva Badad, could the city or could these people be sitting alone? So what Eicha really means, according to this measure, as many of you have pointed out, is Eicha means how. But there's one problem with that. What's the problem with asking how? What's the problem with Yirmiyahu asking how? In Judaism, do we ever ask how? Meaning, what is the classic Jewish response to tragedy? Let's say somebody suffers a horrific loss. What do we generally expect?
Why did it happen?
Do we ever ask the question of how did this happen, or how could this happen? Why did this happen? Is that the type of question that we often encourage someone to ask? Generally, when it comes to halacha, we have something called tziduk hadin. What does tziduk hadin mean? Now again, I'm not criticizing chas v'shalom or saying that a person might not naturally ask that question. Of course, someone struggles with a tragedy, someone has something in their life that's challenging. It's normal to ask how or why, but yet in Judaism, the response to that very often is, we never know. We never know. And therefore we say, right, what is the whole idea of Baruch Dayan Emet? Is we encourage the person to move from a place of how and why to a place of, as much as they can, acceptance. Okay, as Rav Soloveitchik in another context used to say that in Judaism, when tragedy strikes, we don't ask why, we ask what. We don't say lama, because we'll never know why. We'll never know what God. Well, that's God's realm. We don't say lama, we say lima. Lima means for what purpose? What is HaKadosh Baruch Hu trying to teach us? What does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want from us? And that is generally how we as Jews try to deal with tragedy, is of course on a human level to ask the question why and to ask the question how is normal. But yet there's never going to be a proper response because we as human beings, finite human beings, will never understand never understand God's ways. So what we try to do is instead of saying lama, we say lema. We try to encourage somebody to accept Baruch Dayan Emet, to bless the God who is the ultimate judge, to be able to come to some kind of acceptance. It might be a challenge and it's going to take a lot of time. And yet our general approach always is for what? What does God try to teach us? But there is one exception. And the one exception is Eicha. It's Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, Yirmiyahu comes and says, Eicha, how can Hashem do this? And he challenges HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the question is why? Why all of a sudden are we kind of throwing out the general Jewish approach to tragedy, and we're now all of a sudden allowing ourselves to ask why? So look at source number 4 of Soloveitchik deals with this in very, very beautiful terms. Eicha means how or why. How is it possible? How could you have done it? Why did you do it? I don't understand. But this raises a very serious question. What right do we have to say Kinot, to ask and to complain? Normally, the rule is to the contrary. We are not allowed to ask such questions. And again, when he means not allowed, means it might be human to do so, but we encourage ourselves to move past it. from a religious perspective, we try to encourage. That's not the kind of question that we try to work with. On any other day, simply because we don't have the answer. On any other day, if God forbid disaster strikes, the law is that a Jew cannot ask Eicha. Why? The very question of Eicha is intolerable. Who am I to ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to explain anything to me? What do you mean, how or why? Who are you to understand? What allows you to be so bold? What right do you have to address to HaKadosh Baruch Hu this way? When tragedy strikes, the Jew says, Tziduk Hadin. He acknowledges the justness of the decree of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We never find the question of Eicha in the ordinary course of events. The catastrophe of the Churban Beit HaMikdash is the one exception to this rule. Indeed, we say things in the Kinot that we have no right to say as a matter of course. Meaning, in the Kinot, we will say things that normally during the year we're not supposed to say. We're going to talk in a way that normally we're not supposed to talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But in Tisha B'Av, we are permitted to do something forbidden to us in ordinary circumstances. The Jew is given special permission on Tisha B'Av to ask Eicha. Tisha B'Av, the Churban Beit HaMikdash, enjoys a special license. If we are indeed mourning for the destruction of Jerusalem and the Churban Beit HaMikdash, we have the right to say Eicha, to ask why. But why is today different? Why are we allowed to do something that is prohibited to us every other day of the year? Our right to ask on Tisha B'Av comes from the precedent set for us by Yirmiyah. A special license is granted Knesset Yisrael that allows them to ask Eicha on Tisha B'Av because Yirmiyah wrote a book in the biblical canon that begins with the word Eicha. Sefer Eicha, as we know as Megillah Eicha, is not the introduction to the Kinot. It is Kinot. In fact, Sefer Eicha is not known as Megillas Eicha, but as Megillas Kinot, or Sefer Kinot. The first Sefer HaKinot was Eicha. And so Soloveitchik is pointing out that the reason why on Tisha B'Av we're allowed to act or talk in a different way than we normally are is because we received that permission from Yirmiyahu HaNavi. The fact that Yirmiyahu HaNavi wrote a Sefer that his visceral response to the destruction of Beit HaMikdash began with Eicha, that is what allows us to enter and to be able to ask those same questions. And by the way, Rav Soloveitchik points out that the fact that Eicha, and if you want to call it in Lamdus terms, in kind of like, if you want to get to Lamdus, Eicha becomes the matir. Eicha is what permits us, gives us the permission to then be able to talk and in the ways that we normally aren't able to. And this, Rav Soloveitchik explains, is why we read Megillas Eicha at night. Normally, we don't read Megillas at night, with the exception of Megillas Esther that's read twice. All other Megillot that we read them during the day when most people are coming to shul, when it's an easier time to get there. So why is it, except for Esther, but Esther we read twice, okay? But all the other Megillas that we read, if there's a Megillah that we read only once, when do we read it? During the day. So why are we reading Megillas Eicha at night? So Soloveitchik points out that part of the reason we're reading it at night is because if we want to have kinos at night, and we're going to have kinos at night in order to set the tone for what Tisha B'Av is going to be, we cannot halachically begin the kino without first reading Eicha. Eicha is the matir. Eicha is what enables us to then take from Yirmiyahu and begin to ask these questions ourselves. And that's why it has to be at night, and it has to be the first thing we do before we begin the Kinot at night. Because Eicha is the most authentic kina that then sets the tone for the rest of the Kinot. And Soloveitchik also notes that as opposed to the other Megillas, Megillas Esther is unique because it's connected to Purim and it's part of the day. But all other Megillas that we read are not actual mitzvot, they're thematically somehow connected to the day. Says Rav Soloveitchik, Megillas Eicha is fundamentally different. Megillas Eicha is the text of the day. It's like the Torah reading, quote unquote, of the day on some level. And therefore, Megillas Eicha is fundamentally different than everything else, than everything else that we do. So what we see here is basically that the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash was a game changer, which we know. Obviously, we know that. That's like an understatement of the year. But what we see from this halachic analysis is that the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash is the one case where we have an exception to the rule of questioning God, of challenging God, of asking questions to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we normally don't ask or normally are encouraged not to ask. Basically, those questions are considered chutzpahdik. They're considered inappropriate. Who are you to challenge Hashem? Who are you to say how and why? And yet, one day a year, with the permission granted to us by Yirmiyahu, we are able to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to say why, and to ask those questions in a very, very important way. Which means that that's how we're supposed to be spending our Tisha B'Av. this is important. It's important for us to understand that Tisha B'Av for us should be a day where we're thinking about these kinds of events, thinking about how this is a unique day and taking advantage of that day to sit and to try to properly ask these questions and process them in the way that we can. Yes?
Who was a bit chastising on Yisrael. They got punished.
Good.
He's
Okay.
the one who's always...
Okay, so what you're pointing out, which I think is a very, very important piece, and we're going to get to this also. This is true. When we start to talk about the themes in the keynote, you're 100% correct. That when we start to go into the keynote and we look into the keynote, and this is true in Megillas Eicha as well. There's always a very interesting balance in the Megillah and in the keynotes, which is balance between a listing of the destruction and the pain and the suffering, and then always also talking about our sins. And there's no question that there's going to be a connection between the two, and that on some level we believe that things that are happening to us, the things that happen to us, are a result of our actions on a larger scale. Absolutely, and that's very much what Tisha B'Av is about as well. Is sitting with that pain, and also taking responsibility for that pain. But I think that it's more than that. Meaning, Rav Soloveitchik used to say it, and many people used to say that there's two aspects to Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is both what we call a Yom Ta'anit and also a Yom Avilut. What does that mean? What's a Yom Ta'anit? Okay, we have Yom Ta'anit means Tisha B'Av is a fast day. Now we have fast days throughout the year, right? We have fast days throughout the year, and what's the purpose of a fast day generally throughout the year? Tshuva. Tshuva. We think about our deeds, we think about what we've done wrong, and we also then try to correct them and do tshuva. That is what Yom Ta'anit is, and Tisha B'Av has that element. I mean, has an element of what we call Yom Ta'anit. But, says Rav Soloveitchik, it's not just Yom Tshuva. Yom Kippur is the Yom Tshuva. All other fast days are mostly about Yom Tshuva. Tisha B'Av is a little bit different. Tisha B'Av has another aspect to it called Yom Avilut. What does Avilut mean? Mourning. Now, it means that aside from the need to improve and understand what you've done wrong, there's also something to just sitting with the sadness, sitting with the destruction, and just experiencing it. And some might argue that it's parts of the day, that the morning is when we sit with the sadness, and then after Chatzot, we're there's less sadness, and we're focusing more on the tshuva. There's no question that both of these are there, and we have to think about how to improve ourselves, and that's a big theme. But there's also an element of not just thinking about how to improve, but just wallowing. The way that I would say is wallowing in the depth of the pain of what we're experiencing. Exactly. Meaning when someone suffers a loss, there's always going to be, what can I do? How can I move forward? What new things can I bring? To bring that person. But there's also just the importance of mourning. And that's what Tisha B'Av is fundamentally. It's a Yom Avilut and also incorporates Yom. And I think that's what we're doing here. That's what Soloveitchik is suggesting. That the first thing we're going to do is Eicha just means we sit and we say, God, how could you do this? How could you do? Now, again, normally we don't ask those questions, but we're sitting there, we're experiencing the pain, we're talking about the pain, and that is a very, very important part of what we're doing before we even get to how can I make this better? What have I done wrong? And how can I improve? Yes. Absolutely. Excellent question. The question was, that I've been talking mostly about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Is it also appropriate to ask these questions and to talk about other tragedies that fell? Absolutely. Not only that, but it's mandated, which is why in the keynote, as we're going to get to soon, when we go through some of the themes of the keynote start with the Beit HaMikdash, and then they very, very quickly move to other tragedies until we even get to contemporary tragedies. And in fact, halachically, there are many people who believe that this is the day where we commemorate and mourn all tragedies that befell the Jewish people. There was a big halachic debate about the establishment of Yom HaShoah for many different reasons. One of the reasons was because it's established in Nisan, and whether it was appropriate to establish it during Nisan because a day of sadness during Nisan. But one of the main reasons that some were opposed to the establishment of Yom HaShoah is because they believed, and Rav Soloveitchik, I believe, was one of them. He believed that we already commemorate everything on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is the day we commemorate all tragedies. So I would say not only is it allowed, but it's mandated that should be a part of this conversation as well. I think that fundamentally should all flow from the lack of Beit HaMikdash, and a proper understanding of that helps us relate to the other things as well. But there's no question that it's easier for us to relate to the more contemporary tragedies as well. Okay, so that is one understanding of the word Eicha. One understanding of the word Eicha is, as we pointed out, Eicha means how or why. And in fact, many point out that there's a potential response. what's the response that many point out to our Eicha? Is that if you look very closely, again, we're not going to look at this medrash, but if you look at the medrash in source number 5, the medrash references that the same letters of the word Eicha are said by HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Sefer Bereshis. What are the words of Eicha that are said by Hashem in Sefer Bereshis? Ayeka. Ayeka, right? In source number 5 of the medrash, because it brings a clear connection between Eicha, between our saying Eicha to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Hashem saying Ayeka, those same letters, but a different meaning. Ayeka means, where are you in this whole conversation? Which again, highlights maybe the response. We sit there, we mourn, and we're sad, and then afterwards we say, where's our responsibility in this? Ayeka means, where are you? It's almost as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as he did to Adam Rishon, is saying to us, well, where are you in this picture? Where are you in all of this? Where's your taking accountability and responsibility for everything that you've done? You're asking how this could happen? Look around you. Look at what's happened. Look at everything that's been done. And it's almost as if we move from the mourning to then hopefully connecting to the response and taking a certain amount of accountability and responsibility. So that's one understanding of the word Eicha. However, if you look in the art scroll Kinos, they have a different translation of the word Eicha. Their translation of the word Eicha is, I'll use the word that they use, alas. Alas. What does alas mean? Like a krecht, right? That's the only way, right? So according to this understanding, what is happening? What does the word Eicha mean? Eicha doesn't just mean why. According to this understanding, we're not asking Hashem why. What we're doing is we're like sighing. We're almost as if, right? When does a person say alas, or like when does a person make krechs? When they just don't have words to describe the pain that they're experiencing. So it's when Yirmiyahu opens up with Eicha, it's not just that he's asking, according to this understanding, why. He's just turning to Hashem and saying, like, oi, exactly, oi, like Hashem, look what's happening. Look at what's happening. How can this happen? So one side of it is how, the other side is just, I'm speechless. I have nothing to say. I don't know what to say, and I don't know. And that, according to Chazal, according to this understanding, is what Yirmiyahu is saying. But that's really fascinating if you think about it, because what it's basically saying is you have a Navi b'Yisrael who's speechless. Like, this is a Navi. His whole tafkid is the world of Nevuah, of prophecy, of talking and encouraging and talking to Hashem, talking to Am Yisrael, describing the day here. All of a sudden, it's like he has nothing to say. And what that highlights, obviously, was the experience that he was experiencing, the amount of sadness, the despondency that he was experiencing at what he was experiencing. And in fact, if you look here in source number 6, another way to say it is that sometimes when a person goes through an event that is so traumatic, so challenging, so hard, they don't have the words to describe it. Where do we see something similar? Source number 6, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is talking about the fact that certain aspects of Am Yisrael, that part of our punishments were done with, the description was done from using the letters Aleph all the way through Taf. So says the Gemara, Mipnei ma laku be'alef bet. Why were Am Yisrael smitten with Aleph Bet? Aleph Bet meaning the description that was used was from Aleph all the way. If you look in Megillas Eicha, in a number of different places, you have him going from Aleph all the way to Taf. Mipnei she'avru al haTorah shenitna be'alef Bet, because they violated the Torah which was given by Aleph Bet. And what this is highlighting, when a person, a classic example that I can think of is, there's a famous song that we sing on Shabbat morning. We sing Kel Adon al Kol HaMa'asim. Right? We sing this song, we sing this in Shacharis to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it goes from Aleph to Taf. What's the symbolism of having a song that starts with Aleph and goes all the way to Taf? Why do many people, when they're writing piyutim, go from Aleph to Taf? What's the symbolism? They want to encompass everything. When we say, we're basically saying HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Kel Adon, we're saying we want to praise you, but we don't have the words. We could go all the way from Aleph to Taf, and it still wouldn't be enough to praise you. What's the symbolism in contrast to Aleph to Taf in Eicha? What's the symbolism, the fact that Yirmiyahu, when he's describing, and many of the Kinos, when they're describing the destruction, they go from Aleph to Taf? What are they basically saying? I don't have the words to describe the pain. Unimaginable. I don't have the words to describe the pain of what we're feeling. I don't have the words to describe everything that's going on here. And therefore, I'm just going to say it the way that I can, Aleph to Taf, to show that I don't have the words. Look at source number 7. The use of an alphabetical sequence to praise God or describe a person or concept denotes totality and perfection. For example, the passage of Eicha describes in 22 alphabetically arranged verses the entire range of the woman's virtues in following the ways of the Torah. The very Torah that was translated into human expression by means of these same 22 letters. In a less happy use, alphabetic acrostics are employed to symbolize totality of destruction and transgression, in order to indicate that God's full fury was unleashed against the people of Israel. And so again, what we see here is we're using the Aleph Beis in the same way that we would when we're praising HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're turning to Hashem and saying, this destruction is so horrible, is so horrific, is so unimaginable, that I can't even put it into words. And so what we've seen so far, we've highlighted two themes within Megillas Eicha. Theme one was the concept of Ayeka, meaning how or why, highlighting the fact that when it comes to Megillas Eicha, we ask questions, or on Tisha B'Av we ask questions that normally cannot be asked. And the second theme we've seen here is Ayeka, meaning alas, oi, the krecht. We don't have the words to describe to properly describe how we're feeling. That's how Yirmiyahu is, and that's how, on some level, we're meant to try to tap into on the days of Tisha B'Av. There's one other theme within Eicha that I like to highlight before we get to the Kinos, and that is if your person looks at Eicha and just tries to read Eicha straight, there's a lot of jumping around. There are moments of intense sadness, and then it jumps very quickly to moments of deep hope. Sometimes a little bit of happiness even, and then back immediately to intense sadness. And it seems like it's very, very strange. Is this person happy? Are they sad? Are they deeply unhappy? Are they hopeful? It seems very, very strange. How can it be that within the same few psukim, a person just jumps back and forth between different emotions? The obvious answer to that, but it bears mentioning, is that that's the human experience. The human experience, we very often expect that our emotions are going to, move in a linear fashion, from A to B. If I'm happy, I'm just going to be happy, happy, happy. That's not how humans are. Naturally, our emotions jump from one to the next. Naturally, our emotions will be from one all the way, sometimes from one extreme to the other times within a certain balance. But it's natural for us to be experience extreme happiness one moment, and a few minutes later, for whatever reason, experience challenge or sadness. Dr. Yael Ziegler, in an essay on Eicha, notes this in beautiful words. Source number 8. Eicha's seemingly inconsistent and rapidly changing attitudes towards God may be explained by the fact that emotions lie at its core. Is God just or not? An intellectual consideration of the matter approaches the question systematically, offering coherent logical arguments. However, when humans address the same events through an emotional lens, contradictions abound. God is both just and unjust. Humans are simultaneously baffled, abashed, angered, and comforted by God. The ebb and flow of human emotions and the way they shift and converge, collide and contradict can account for the rapid swing between different perspectives in Eicha. This represents the emotional conditions of humans, offering a realistic and multifaceted portrait of how humans cope with God's role in their tragedy. And so what we're seeing with Yirmiyahu and Eicha, and the same thing we see often in the Kinot, if you look very, very carefully, is just the general experience of a human emotion. Somebody who at times is despondent, and then moments later, all of a sudden, there's a glimmer of hope that he feels. And then maybe that even touches upon a certain amount of happiness before it goes back into despondency. That is the human condition. That is who we are. That is how we are built. And what Eicha does is it highlights that in a very, very dramatic way. So these are the three themes that I wanted to highlight with Eicha. Just things for us to think about, for us to maybe ponder a little bit more as we're getting ready for Tisha B'Av. Number one meaning of Ayeka. Ayeka with an understanding of why, how, which is an unusual question we can't ask, but on Tisha B'Av we can. Ayeka meaning alas, oi, this understanding of this questioning, this inability to properly experience or discuss or verbalize the intensity of the emotion. And the third is this jumping around from different emotions, how Eicha captures the human condition in a very, very powerful way by recognizing that our emotions don't work in linear fashion as much as we would like them to, and that we as human beings very often will jump from one emotion to the next. What I'd like to do now with the remaining time that we have, we don't have a ton of time, so we're going to go a little bit quicker, is to highlight some of the themes. I haven't gone quick enough now. Is to highlight some of the themes of the Kinot. Okay, Kinot are what we do, or how we spend most of our day on Tisha B'Av. And I would encourage those who are able to and feel well enough when it comes to the fasting, those who are able to fast. If you have time and you're feeling well enough, I encourage you to go to your local shul and to engage in this recital of the Kinot. If you need to be at home, there are numerous different options where you can get a live stream of a number of different people who are doing Kinot throughout the day that are being live streamed over the internet. But the best way that we can connect to the day is through the recital of the Kinot. But as with anything, in order to properly understand the Kinot, we need to kind of understand what's the overall structure of the Kinot, what's the goal of the Kinot, what's the purpose, and what are we trying to get to. So what I'd like to do is just kind of go through and highlight a number of different themes. Once again, most of what I'm going to share with you really is developed by Rav Soloveitchik in his wonderful book.
So before Rav Soloveitchik, it was really a massive difference between the past 2000.
So I'm gonna. The question that was asked was there really such a difference since Rav Soloveitchik? I haven't found other books. Doesn't mean that they don't exist. No, meaning I don't know. What I mean is my understand. I know that for me, my experience at Tisha B'Av drastically changed when I was able to understand. Meaning, I remember as a kid, I would go and I'd say the Kinot. I didn't really understand most of what I was reading, and sometimes I had the English translation, sometimes I didn't, and I found it harder to connect to. From the moment that I was able to tap into some of the explanations that are given by Rav Soloveitchik, it made it much easier for me. And I have heard it said that his explanations did open up a world of Kinot. Doesn't mean that there weren't other people. I don't want to. Meaning, it could be there were, and I just did not stumble upon them. But in order to really understand the Kinot, it takes not just a certain brilliance. There's also the language is very hard to. Sometimes it's hard to understand. It's not just a Torah knowledge. It's also an ability to appreciate the language that's being used. It's poetry. It's prose. And therefore it requires someone who has an unusual combination of eloquence and knowledge to be able to understand and then relay some of those messages. So it could be there are other great. Meaning, as I said, Art Scroll came out with an English translation many years ago. And it's a wonderful translation. The introduction is excellent. But I still didn't feel like I fully understood it. And I feel like a lot of what I was able to gain from it came from Soloveitchik, but it could very well be that I'm sure there are other people as well. I just don't know anyone who's, I guess, that it's been kind of like that most of what he said has gone around as much and has been spread around as much. At least certainly not in our circles. So again, as we mentioned, the Kinot are basically just the next step from Eicha. Eicha is the first Kina, and what the Kinot do is the Kinot are meant to put words to our sense of loss and to our sense of destruction. Now, by the way, in the back of your sheet, I don't know if someone could just check the last page on your sheets. I asked them to a list. There should be a list of the Kinot. Yes, so that's just for you as reference if you want to. What I'm going to do is we're going to go through, we're not going to go Kina by Kina, it'll take way too long to do that, but I wanted to just highlight because there actually is an actual process that we're going through when we go through the Kinot. The beginning of the Kinot highlight a certain type of theme. As you go on in the Kinot, they hire more themes, and I want to just highlight for you, as way of introduction to understand what we're doing when we go through the Kinot. So if you want to mark up or use as reference the list of the Kinot that I copied for you as well, that might help. So the first number of Kinot, as we've mentioned, if we go through the Kinot, again, we're not going to go through each one. The first number of Kinot, I would say the first 4 or 5 we say on Tisha B'Av night. Then we start with Kina Vav, the 6th Kina. We start with the next day after Shacharit. And if you look through the first, I would say 17, 18, 19 Kinot, the themes are the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. There's no question. That is the biggest theme. That's from the Art Scroll Kinot. That's from the Art Scroll Kinot. Yes, that is from the Art Scroll Kinot. I should have written that on top. So that is basically a table of contents from the Art Scroll Kinot, the Art Scroll translation of the Kinot. And if you look there, you can see that most of the Kinot of that we start with, and it makes sense, are destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. If you look through the Kinot, the 2 themes that are highlighted are the ones we've mentioned before, which is A, a description of the destruction, and then B, a list of our actions and our sins. And very often the Kinot will jump back and forth between the 2 of them. As we mentioned, that because there's 2 aspects of the day of Tisha B'Av. There's the Yom Avilut, where we're just sitting and wallowing in the pain, wallowing in the sadness. And Tisha B'Av is also a Yom Ta'anit, where we have to recognize our contribution to what occurred, and to strive to do tshuva. That is what the first 17, 18 Kinot are about. beginning with Kinot number 21. Again, I don't have the list on me actually, so I don't have the name of it. But Kinot, it's the one about the Asara Haruge Malchut. All of a sudden, when we get to Kinot number Kaf Aleph, Asura Haruge Malchut, the 10 martyrs that were killed, we shift in our focus. At this point in time, we're no longer just talking about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. We are now beginning to talk about other tragedies in Jewish history. And of course, says Rosh Soloveitchik and many other poskim, today is the day to comment on that. Look at source number 9. Rosh Soloveitchik explains why. Tisha B'Av is more. It is a day of mourning not only for the tragedies that occurred on it, but for any exile, any tragedy, any disaster that has struck our people whenever it may have occurred. Tisha B'Av is the day to commemorate Churban in general, to mourn for all the tragedies and all the disasters that have struck the Jewish people throughout our long history. In one of the Kinot about the Crusades, entitled Mi Yitain Roshi Mayim, we read, V'chi eno lehosif moed shever v'tavera, that it is inappropriate to add another holiday or another commemoration to what we have already. We are not to add a separate fast day or additional day of mourning to commemorate any additional catastrophe, disaster, massacre, devastation, or destruction. No fast day other than Tisha B'Av is to be established. No additional days can be designated to commemorate later tragedies. On Tisha B'Av, we fast and mourn for all tragedies and all our disasters. It is not only the day that commemorates the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and the other tragedies that occurred on it, but that day that commemorates every destruction, the countless destructions we have experienced as a people down through the ages. There is a halacha that one must not establish or designate a separate day of mourning in commemoration of a tragedy in addition to Tisha B'Av. The many tragedies and disasters that occurred in Jewish history should be recounted, described, and portrayed, mourned and eulogized on Tisha B'Av, not on any other day. And that is why additional tragedies were introduced into the mourning of Tisha B'Av. The mourning is not only for the Churban Beit HaMikdash, but for much more. It is mourning for Churban Yisrael in every fashion and manner, whether spiritually or materially. In fact, Churban Yisrael is a part of the Churban Beit HaMikdash because, and this is an important point, if the Beit HaMikdash were standing, our destiny would have been different. Why does Rosh Soloveitchik feel that it's important that Tisha B'Av is the day that we mourn every tragedy? Because fundamentally, the root of every tragedy that befell the Jewish people, the root of its cause is the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Had the Beit HaMikdash been standing, things would be drastically different. And therefore, it's most appropriate that the same day that we mourn the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, that is the day that we mourn everything else that happens.
I don't understand that.
One second, let me just finish. All of them are a direct result of Churban Beit HaMikdash. Had the destiny of the Beit HaMikdash been different, all the catastrophes and disasters would never have happened. If not for the Churban Beit HaMikdash, the Crusades and the Hitler Holocaust, for example, would not have taken place. Every disaster is a result of Churban Beit HaMikdash. That destruction is responsible for everything. Yes, question.
No, I don't understand how you can say that.
You don't understand how you can say that. So it is definitely something that. Yeah, I mean, there's a correct.
Exile, but he thinks that that's all part of the same package.
Correct. Meaning, again, I don't think it's not the kind of thing that I would have felt comfortable saying in such an intense way. Meaning, only someone of a certain stature can make a comment like that. But at the same time, I think what he's basically suggesting is that our reality is different when there's a Beit HaMikdash. We don't fully understand what that means. Our connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our strength as a people, our strength as a nation, and so many factors are different when there is a Beit HaMikdash. The reality, meaning, I think it's hard for us to understand it because I don't think we can fully properly understand.
It's full of idol worship and everything else.
True, correct. What you're pointing out is that even during the times when there was a Beit HaMikdash, we as a people committed certain sins which led to destruction and led to, meaning obviously the fact that there was a destruction of Beit HaMikdash means that not that it can't happen. I think what he is saying is that when there is a Beit HaMikdash, or if there were to be a third Beit HaMikdash, which is also understood to be fundamentally different from the first two, our reality would be different, and therefore the nature of things would be different. But the key that he's saying here is that therefore it's most appropriate to
People miss what happens was there's a whole different.
correct. 100%. 100%, and that's obviously when we talk about the Beit HaMikdash, we talk about our relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what we mean, that is ultimately the Shekhinah. But as some of them are pointing out, there was a time when there was a Beit HaMikdash, and yet if you read through Melachim, things did happen. Meaning things did happen. As a result, so therefore, it's hard for us to fully understand that, because how could it be that there was a destruction if there was a Shekhinah during the time of the second Beit HaMikdash? So these are things that we don't fully understand. That's I think the main question. But it could be the differentiation between the second and third.
Wasn't it the day the spies came back?
That yes, Tisha B'Av was also the day. No, we didn't discuss it today, but that certainly is mentioned in. I'm just because of time, because we only have a couple of more minutes. Yes, we didn't hit on everything. We didn't hit on everything on Tisha B'Av. I want to just highlight a couple of other things, important themes in the. I want to highlight a couple of other themes in the. So we've talked about how we went from destruction of Beit HaMikdash to all types of destruction, all types of tragedy. If you look and you go on, the Rav. If you move to. Sorry, 1 minute. Kinot 23, which is a couple of kinos later, we actually do something a little bit different. Rav Soloveitchik points out that in Kinot number 23, we don't just talk about communal tragedy, we begin to talk about personal tragedy. And this is a Kinot that talks about the son and the daughter of Rabbi Yishmael Kohen HaGadol, who were separated at birth, didn't recognize each other, were put into a room together. And if you go through that Kinot, it's a powerful Kinot, and there's so much to learn from that Kinot. But Rav Soloveitchik pointed out from that Kinot was something very important. This Kinot is not about national tragedy, it's about personal tragedy. What is it doing in our Kinot? Why here are we all of a sudden talking about personal tragedy on a day of national calamity and national destruction? Says Rav Soloveitchik, the way that we as a nation work is, halacha doesn't just recognize and commemorate and mourn national tragedy, we also mourn personal tragedy. Because whenever we're dealing whenever there is national tragedy, and even sometimes when there isn't national tragedy, there is always a certain level of personal tragedy, and the halacha recognizes that and incorporates that into Tisha B'Av as well. Because we're not just, whenever somebody from the Jewish people is in some form of avelut, or some form of destruction, or some sense of loss, that impacts the entire Jewish nation. And that's why, says Rav Soloveitchik, we incorporate this Kinot into our Kinot, because we don't just mourn national tragedies on Tisha B'Av, we also mourn personal tragedies. Again, I'm moving quickly because I want to just finish this last 2 points. As we go on, if you move to Kinot 36, we begin a number of Kinos called Tzion Kinos. Tzion Halo Tishali. Tzion Halo Tishali is a number of kinos that begin to describe the beauty of the Beit HaMikdash, the beauty of Yerushalayim. And what we're doing, says Rav Soloveitchik, and this connects to the SHIUR that we had a couple of weeks ago. The SHIUR we had a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how there are 2 ways to commemorate the Beit HaMikdash. One is called Zecher LeChurban, and one is called Zecher LeMikdash. Zecher LeChurban is when we describe the destruction. That is one way to commemorate the loss of the destruction. Another way to describe the loss of the Beit HaMikdash is Zecher LeMikdash. We don't just talk about the destruction, we talk about how beautiful it once was. We talk about the beauty and the splendor and the connection we had to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Shekhinah resting upon us. We talk about the reality that we had, and that is part of the mourning. That is part of how we mourn for the Beit HaMikdash. And we talked about a couple of weeks ago how you need both of those. And how when it comes to commemorating, we talked about how commemorating the Holocaust, there are different approaches. Should we go back to Poland to see the destruction, or should we go back to Poland to hear and learn about the communities that were, for those who are comfortable going back? And we had an article from Rabbi Norman Lamb, talking about 2 different ways to commemorate 9/11. Is it better to leave ground zero as a place of destruction, or to build something even more beautiful to commemorate the beauty of what the World Trade Center was before? And the same thing is how after October 7th, kibbutzim are struggling as they rebuild their kibbutzim. Should we have a museum? Should we leave certain houses destroyed to commemorate what was? Or should we rebuild and build an even more beautiful kibbutz than we had before? That is how we, in Judaism, the way that we commemorate destruction and more the Beit HaMikdash is both Zecher LeMikdash and Zecher LeChurban. The question is, though, and this is something that a little bit strange, is that it's out of order. Normally, if you had to pick the order of what should come first, which one should come first? Zecher LeMikdash or Zecher LeChurban? Zecher LeMikdash. Why should Zecher LeMikdash come first? Because you want to remember how beautiful it is, and only if you remember how beautiful it is are you then going to appreciate the Churban. So here's my question. We've been discussing the destruction for so many Kinot. All of a sudden, in Kinot 36, we now switch to Zecher LeMikdash. Why not start with Kinot Aleph? Should be about Zecher LeMikdash. Should be about the beauty of Yerushalayim. I believe the answer is we have to understand the nature of what Tisha B'Av is. Fundamentally, Tisha B'Av is a day where we wallow in the sadness and in the destruction. And therefore, the first thing we're going to do is talk about that destruction. Talk about that destruction, sit with that destruction, feel that destruction. Later on, we'll remind ourselves how beautiful it was, and that'll hopefully then help us connect to the destruction as well. But to open up with the beauty and everything, it would almost be taking away from what Tisha B'Av is about, which is a day of sadness and a day where we're meant to sit and wallow in the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. It's not something we want to continue forever. Once Tisha B'Av is over, we're meant to then get up, shake off the dust, and move on, which is a separate question. The whole idea of Nechama, Nachamu Ami. But for these moments, we're supposed to start with the destruction and to wallow in that destruction. Okay, I'm just going to just to summarize what we've done, and I apologize that you're not going to have too much of a break before Rabbi Finkelstein comes in. We tried to highlight a number of different themes, both in Eicha and in the Kinot, as a preparation for Tisha B'Av. We highlighted a couple of important themes regarding the explanation of the word Eicha, Ayeka, or Eicha meaning how could this happen, and the response of Ayeka from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or Eicha meaning alas, we have no words to describe it. We talked about how Eicha also has mixed emotions, varied emotions, because that is mirroring the human experience. We talked about how within the themes of the Kinot, we start with destruction, we start with the Beit HaMikdash, we then shift to national calamities that have befell the Jewish people throughout the ages, because that is a part of the experience of what we're doing on Tisha B'Av. We then talked about how it shifts to not just national calamity, but personal calamity, personal tragedy, which is an important part of it. And then, of course, how it shifts from Zecher Churban, we go to Zecher LaMikdash, because these are two ways for how we commemorate the Beit HaMikdash in our day. And the one thing that I wanted to just mention to end is there is, of course, as the Kinot go on, towards the end of the Kinot, we have that moment where we begin to incorporate Kinot on contemporary issues. On contemporary issues, there's a Kinot about the Holocaust. There's a Kinot about a number of other contemporary issues. You should know that there are Kinot that have been written. Rabbi Schwab wrote something about the Holocaust. There was actually a Kinot, I have it here. Again, for those of you who want to see it, you can even get it. Rabbi Yossi Tzfiri Ron wrote a Kinot about October 7th. That is now, for those of you who get the magazine, Mizrahi magazine is putting a magazine this week. It'll be in the magazine. It's available all over the place. In the upcoming HaMizrahi magazine, this Kinot will be found. It is a Kinot, in my opinion, a beautiful Kinot describing our emotions post October 7th. A number of other people have also done the same thing. We shouldn't do it, take it lightly. It's not the kind of thing that we should do, after every tragedy, but I think October 7th was a game changer in many different ways, and at least it was Rimon felt it appropriate to write a Kinot that many shuls may choose to incorporate as part of their Kinot this year as well. Okay, wishing everybody a meaningful rest of the week and a meaningful and easy fast as well.